Hey everyone, welcome back to the LTOT Read Aloud. Today we are reading chapters 19, 20, and 21. And at long last, Alexander's going to go back to Calathea. Chapter 19, Goodbye, Loathsome Beast. Alexander lay on his back on the grassy lakeshore, attempting to dry himself in the sun. His cloak and outer tunic were draped over a nearby tree branch. He had been walking by the water with Ilona a few moments prior, when the urge to go wading overcame him. Ilona declined to follow him in, so he playfully splashed her. She startled and tumbled into the lake, soaking herself completely through. The moment Alexander pulled her to her feet, she shoved him so that he toppled over, completely drenching himself. Then she refused to let him come to shore until she was satisfied with his pleas for forgiveness. Luckily for Alexander, his planned departure put Ilona in a forgiving mood. They had an agreement. They would travel to Calathea separately, stay on the opposite sides of Lysandria, and act as strangers on any chance encounter. Alexander couldn't risk the twins learning of their relationship and taking Ilona hostage. This was to be their last day together for a long time. They decided to spend it alone, hidden away in the sanctuary of the forest. Ilona lay next to Alexander with her head resting on his shoulder. I don't know why I'm worried about what will happen in Calathea, when I should be worried about you drowning me here, she grumbled. I am so sorry, Ilona, Alexander replied. He had apologized at least 700 times since the incident occurred. This made 701. I feel awful. Good, Ilona answered, snuggling into him. You deserve to feel awful. For a long moment, they both rested quietly, absorbing the sunlight. Alexander? Ilona asked finally. Mm-hmm, Alexander replied. What is expected of a Calathean queen? What do you mean? Alexander replied. I mean, do they manage the kingdom's affairs, or do they hide away in their chambers weaving tapestries? Some of our queens have lived hidden lives, Alexander explained, and some have ruled in their own right. He turned his head to look at her. I have a feeling you will do whatever you please, regardless of tradition. Ilona grinned. Of course I will. It is still good to know what's expected of me. Alexander ran his fingers through her hair. She had been wearing it braided up underneath a thin summer veil, but since her tumble the veil had been removed, and each tangled lock was fleeing in a different direction. She was soppy and muddy and covered in bits of pond scum. She glared sideways at him when he touched her. What are you staring at? She growled. You, he answered, with a subtle smile. Do you have any idea how beautiful you are? Ilona scowled. Stop trying to save yourself, she advised. It's pathetic. May I kiss you? He asked. Did you hear me? She retorted, desperately trying to hide a smile. What was that? He responded, leaning in to kiss her. She gave him a little shove and rolled away, swallowing a giggle. Alexander looked back toward the sky. Kaltahaven was miserable in the winter, but stunning in the summertime. Never had he seen a wood so green, or trees so tall. He wanted to lie in that place forever, listening to the orchestra of birdsong that rang all around him. He closed his eyes. He suddenly felt Ilona snuggling back into him. Forgive me already? He asked. No, but it's a bit cold over there, she answered. A long moment passed, in which they lay silently, each enjoying the presence of the other. Alex, I don't want this day to end, Ilona sighed. We'll have more like it, Alexander replied, when we are home in Calathea. A smile touched her lips. Do you promise? I swear it, he replied. After our victory, we will slip away and do whatever you like. Name it. Then take me to the sea, Ilona answered. Florian says there's nothing so humbling as standing by the sea. A force that can humble Florian must be something to behold. Alexander laughed. Is that all? You don't need to wait for our victory for that. Turn any corner in Lysandria, and you'll find yourself on the shore. Am I really going? Ilona asked with a disbelieving smile. Her excitement delighted him. Calathea would be paradise for her, if they could restore it. He was almost afraid he would lose her forever in the library, if he stopped examining the architecture long enough to enter the building. Of course, even if they were victorious, there would be some challenges to overcome. He sighed, thinking of one in particular. Ilona, there's something you should know. He paused as he tried to think of the right words. Unfortunately, he couldn't think of any way to make his message less unpleasant. After our victory, we will need to face the fact that some Calathians, actually most Calathians, really don't like cults. Oh, I know, Ilona answered. Calathians are a bunch of pretentious snobs that think they are better than everyone else. Wait a moment, you think I'm a pretentious snob? He asked. Ilona smirked. Absolutely, but I love you still. It isn't that Calathians think they are better than cults, Alexander corrected. It is simply that Calathians view cults as primitive. Do you think that? Ilona asked. You are not primitive, Ilona, Alexander answered, and I am sure the people will agree once they get to know you better. I just don't want you to be alarmed if some of the senators call you vile names and then attempt to annul our marriage, that's all. What kind of vile names? Ilona asked. Alexander shrugged. Like insolent low-born she-brute? Ilona suggested. Alexander blushed. Maybe something like that. Or filthy barbarian sow, she tried. That wouldn't be beneath them. Ilona unleashed several more possibilities, grinning as Alexander became increasingly uncomfortable. Don't worry, she finished. For every insult they hurl my way, I'll reward them with 10. Oh dear, Alexander sighed. A picture of a typical day in the Calathian court was developing in his mind. He consoled himself with a reminder that they wouldn't reach that point for a while yet. That reminded him that he was leaving in the morning. May I kiss you now? He pressed. You're persistent, aren't you? Ilona grinned. She whacked him in the lips with the back of her hand. You may kiss my hand. He did so. Then he kissed the back of her wrist, then her forearm, and started working his way up toward her lips. Ilona tried unsuccessfully to keep a smile from escaping. I said my hand, she scolded. Oh, sorry, Alexander answered. I must have drifted. Ilona snorted a laugh and indicated complete forgiveness by grabbing his collar and pulling him in to meet her lips. The next morning, Alexander loaded a cart full of honey, beeswax, and every item that could be produced from these ingredients. Balms and soaps and candles. He was to return to Calathea as a merchant, per Ilona's instructions. He was to travel with Florian to the southern half of Caltahaven. Filbert would meet them there and continue with their party to Calathea. Ilona made her brothers promise they wouldn't leave Alexander's side until the entire affair was over. Alexander protested, worrying that if their party was attacked, all three could be killed off at once, leaving both kingdoms leaderless. He also didn't like the idea of spending months in close quarters with Filbert and Florian. However, Florian insisted that he was going to follow Alexander whether he agreed to it or not. So on the day of departure, they dressed in the humble attire of cultic merchants and prepared to depart. The cart was a significant improvement over the one Alexander owned previously. It was drawn by 2 horses, and there was plenty of room for passengers. Lonzo trotted after Alexander as he finished making preparations. He was sure the old dog would try to follow him all the way to Calathea if he didn't restrain him. He looped a rope around its neck and handed one end to a servant. He knelt down and rubbed the animal between the ears. I don't suppose I will see you again, he said. It's probably for the better. You're a filthy, lazy beast with neither purpose nor manners. Alexander felt a weight in his chest as Lonzo started thumping his tail. You'd never be allowed this kind of freedom in Calathea, you know. You'd sleep in the stables where animals belong. Trust me when I tell you, you're better off here. He tried not to make eye contact with Lonzo as he stood. He didn't need that kind of guilt burdening him now. Maybe you should bring him, Ilona suggested. If you end up starving in the wilderness, you'll have something to eat. Alexander scoffed. Have you looked at that animal? He's old and stringy. Even as rations, he's useless. It's a wonder you keep him around. That's just it, Ilona answered. He's so useless, we can't even spare the effort it would take to get rid of him. Now, do you have time left to say goodbye to me, or did you expend it all on the dog? You I will see again, Alexander teased. But I suppose I can spare a little time. He took her in his arms and held her for so long that Florian had to climb down from the cart and pull them apart. He scolded them and told them that they had been married too long to be so much in love. Alexander managed to slip the key to his workshop into her hand before boarding the cart. She turned it over in her palm, and then shot him a puzzled look. See for yourself, he smiled. She returned his smile, her eyes sparkling with curiosity. You should go. I want to see what you've made for me. Impatient, aren't you? He smirked. Extremely. And with that, the cart lurched forward, and they were on their way. Alexander waved to Ilona as they moved forward down the road. You know, I was in love once, Florian commented bitterly. Oh, Alexander replied, watching Ilona as she faded into the distance. She's married to Filbert now. Alexander turned his attention toward Florian. He was feeling deeply uncomfortable, but also unbearably curious. She said I wasn't her type, Florian finished, staring wistfully into the distance. I see, Alexander mumbled. What followed was a long and torturous silence. If Alexander had looked sideways at Florian, he may have noticed an amused glimmer in his eye, as if he was basking in Alexander's discomfort. But Alexander was making a conscious effort not to look at him, instead keeping his eyes fixed on the road ahead. At last, Alexander glanced backward again. He could still see Erskrim, perched among the hills. It occurred to him that he probably wouldn't see the castle again. Certainly, it wasn't much on the eyes, an ugly pile of gray angles jetting up from the hillside. It was freezing in the winter and dark inside even during the day, but it was the place where he spent the happiest days of his life, and for all its flaws, it felt like home. Chapter 20. Bitey Stingy Things. 3 days later, they rendezvoused with Filbert. His castle was only half the size of Erskrim, really more of a manor house with a wall around it. Alexander couldn't help but wonder how Filbert agreed to such an arrangement. They stayed there 2 nights, resting and preparing themselves for the journey ahead. Filbert's wife was a soft-spoken person, in odd contrast to Filbert. Despite Florian's story, she didn't seem to bear any ill will toward him. In fact, the few times they interacted, it was like the incident that pained Florian so deeply in the retelling never happened at all. Alexander was eager to continue. Now that he'd made up his mind to return, he didn't want to delay. They traveled all through the summer and into the fall. Though it was a wearisome journey, Alexander found it fascinating seeing the changing landscapes and exploring the villages they passed through. The twins, though foolish when it came to philosophy, were wise in the ways of the world. When they encountered others on the roads and in the villages, they instinctively knew who was trustworthy and who wasn't. When they sensed a change in weather, they knew whether to chance proceeding or not. Though they drove Alexander to the brink of insanity on more than one occasion, he had to admit that he would have been lost without them. The weeks dragged on as they pressed forward. Alexander began to think they would never arrive. But as they moved farther south, the landscape changed. The lush forest gave way to rocky hillsides, dotted with shorter greenery. The sun grew brighter, and Alexander felt a strange nostalgic happiness wash over him. One morning, he woke to the sensation of something crawling across his blanket directly over his chest. They were camping a short distance from the road. He opened his eyes to see Filbert and Florian, both standing over him with horrified expressions. Filbert had his blade raised, and Florian was holding his arm, whispering, "Don't, you'll kill Alexander." "What's crawling on me?" Alexander grumbled, though he expected he already knew. "It's a crab demon with a catapult stinger on its rear," Florian hissed. "Don't move." Alexander rolled his eyes. He gripped his blanket and sat up slowly, allowing the enemy to slide into his lap. Then he took the lamp from beside him and crushed the crab demon to oblivion. Filbert and Florian made a horrified gasp with each blow. Alexander took the flattened remains by the tail and held it up for the twins to see. He couldn't help but smile as they shrunk backward. "This is a scorpion," he explained. Considering the twins were somewhat well-traveled, he was surprised they hadn't encountered one before. Then again, scorpions avoided humans when possible. "What happens if it stings you?" Filbert asked. Alexander widened his eyes in mock horror. "Heaven forbid!" he exclaimed. "You might end up with an itchy swelling on your arm. Even warriors such as yourselves couldn't bear it." The horror faded from their faces. Filbert lowered his blade. "You're hilarious," Florian remarked. "Any other demon creatures you forgot to warn us about?" "Let me think," Alexander began. "Lots in the sea. On land, just the scorpion. Oh, and the rock viper." Hides in the brush, the bite is lethal, so don't step on it. He yawned, tossed the scorpion aside, and pulled the blanket over his head. Other bugs, I think. I don't know. Why on earth do you want this kingdom? Filbert complained. It's full of bitey, stingy things. Don't bother them, they won't bother you, was Alexander's muffled response. Though it was a warm day, Filbert and Florian both decided to wear their boots. Several villages back, Alexander traded his for a pair of sandals. As they packed their things and started on their journey, Alexander warned, "There is a creature in Calathea far more lethal than the rock viper." Filbert and Florian glanced at each other apprehensively. "It won't wait until you step on it to strike. When it's made up its mind to kill you, it will hunt you down, pursuing you with an endurance only hatred can supply. It has killed more Calatheans than all other beasts combined. I myself barely escaped it as I made my way to Caltahaven for the first time." Filbert and Florian's expressions were of both horror and intrigue. "What is this creature?" Florian asked. "When we are through with reclaiming your kingdom, we should hunt these animals and bring their heads back with us to Caltahaven." "I'd rather you didn't," Alexander replied. "If you are going to hunt humans, hunt your own subjects, not mine." Alexander's point did not ease the twins' fear of the various bitey, stingy things that lurked in the wilderness around them. They became the subject of his endless mockery as they carefully scanned the road and double-checked their campsites before lying down. It was nice to be the instigator of mockery for once as opposed to being the subject. Alexander had the good fortune of stumbling upon a harmless rat snake one day, which he slipped into Florian's blanket while he was sleeping. He might have felt guilty about the anxiety he induced if Florian hadn't taken vengeance by seizing him and throwing him into a lake. After several more weeks of travel, the twins began to realize that nature did not have a personal vendetta against them, and their precautions became more sensible and less paranoid. Then, one wonderful day, as they passed through a village, Alexander heard voices speaking Greek. Alexander, who hated to talk, was suddenly talking to anyone and everyone he encountered. He commented on the weather, asked for the news, and made all manner of chatter he normally found pointless and dull. Filbert and Florian knew a little Greek, enough to ask directions and purchase supplies, but they didn't have the patience to take lessons from Alexander. At times he would try speaking to them in his native tongue. They could usually understand him, but would always answer in Celtic. The twins let him do the talking for them most of the time. He learned a number of interesting things in his conversations. For example, Calatheans were leaving the kingdom in droves. He encountered several in the village, all of whom warned him sternly not to continue his journey. They told him that the old gods had returned and taken control of the capital. They were subjecting the people to all kinds of cruelty. As if tyrannical gods weren't bad enough, a few months ago, barbarians started migrating to the kingdom in massive numbers. They were cults mostly, loud, rowdy, and probably carrying diseases. The people petitioned the Senate and their gods to deport them all. Unfortunately, with so many Calatheans fleeing, there was a labor shortage, and the Senate couldn't afford to lose them. The gods responded by forbidding Calatheans from leaving. The borders were heavily guarded. If Alexander chose to return, he would have to stay. Chapter 21. The Brew of Islam. Alexander should have been terrified. The stronghold that marked the Calathean border was in sight. It was an impenetrable fortress that arched across the roadway. Guards patrolled all around it, and archers watched from the towers to make sure no one slipped past. It was forbidden to bring weapons of war into the country. At least it had been when Alexander was king. All blades had to be shorter than the traveler's forearm. Alexander and his two companions each had a broadsword hidden in the secret compartment built into the bottom of the wagon. The border guards weren't likely to do a thorough search unless they had reason to be suspicious. Of course, if they recognized Alexander as a wanted murderer, that would be plenty of reason. So much could go wrong. Alexander was on the threshold of certain doom, yet he felt a sense of peace and purpose. As strange as it was, he was also excited. This was his home, and these were his people. They took their place in the line of merchants waiting for admittance. There were only 2 carts ahead of them. Under the circumstances, Alexander shouldn't have been surprised by this, that he was used to seeing long lines of visitors waiting at these checkpoints. There was an official speaking with the merchant at the head of the line. These border officials received a new title every couple of years, But last Alexander remembered, they were called trade custodians. There was a table by the gate with a large book on it. The custodian on duty was a tiny ball of a man who bounced up and down on his heels as he argued with the merchant before him. The subject of their disagreement was... Alexander leaned in to listen. Arabian brewing beans? Alexander furrowed his brow. What on earth were Arabian brewing beans? I'm sorry, the official was saying, but we've readopted the religion of our ancestors and are now worshipping the twin gods Tithys and Areti. We do not drink the brew of Islam. I'm a Christian and I drink the brew of Islam, the trader objected. Everyone should be drinking the brew of Islam. Muslims make good brew. In the end, the trader was refused passage and walked back along the road swearing under his breath. The second trader was caught smuggling a skeletal hand. He claimed it was the hand of Saint Valerian, a priceless relic. The custodian was a bit skeptical because he had already confiscated at least 8 hands belonging to Saint Valerian from other travelers. So the second trader was also denied passage. It seemed the Calathians were not admitting any visitors today. Fortunately, Alexander's cart neither contained suspicious Islamic beverages nor the skeletal remains of saints. 2 cults and a fugitive were all they had to be concerned about. One of the guards motioned for Alexander to come forward. When the trade custodian saw Filbert and Florian, he sighed deeply. More cults, he grumbled, and then he looked at Alexander. Then, looking at Alexander, he asked, "And where are you from?" "Where am I coming from now, or where am I from originally?" Alexander asked. "Both," the man answered. "I am coming from Caltahaven. I was born in Lysandria." The custodian dropped his pen and looked at Alexander, astonished. "You're a Calathian?" "I am, sir," Alexander answered. "Are you sure you are headed in the right direction?" the official asked. "Toward home," Alexander replied. "Where else would I be going?" "How long have you been gone?" 5 years. "Then you've missed some things," the custodian proceeded. "Take my advice. Turn around and go back where you came from." "It can't be that bad," Alexander answered. The man grimaced at him. "If you choose to pass through this gate, you will not be allowed to leave." "Why not?" Alexander asked. "The gods have mandated it," the man clarified. "Calathea is short on Calathians." "Gods," Alexander replied. "I have missed some things, haven't I?" "Go home, kid," the custodian grumbled. "I will if you'll let me," Alexander pressed. "I meant back to..." He rubbed his forehead with one hand. "Where did you say you were coming from?" "Caltahaven." The custodian let out an irritated sigh and glanced at the twins who were standing behind Alexander. "You aren't the one who's been sending all these cults, are you?" Alexander laughed. "Have many cults passed this way?" "So many, they are all starting to look the same," the man replied, glancing again at Filbert and Florian. "Perhaps I am," Alexander answered. "Anyone who heard me boasting of my homeland would migrate immediately." The pity the custodian was feeling for Alexander was written plainly on his face. He shook his head and grumbled. "What do you have in your cart?" "Every good a bee can provide. Honey, beeswax, soap." "You were selling soap to the cults?" the official questioned. "God bless you." "Don't you mean gods bless you?" Alexander replied. The official rolled his eyes. "Whatever." He walked around to the back of the cart and examined the contents. Then, lifting out a sealed jug of something, said, "Is this mead?" Alexander nodded. "I'm afraid I'm going to have to confiscate this," he said, and placed the jug on his table. "Proceed," he said, taking his seat and marking something in his book. Alexander figured the man would question Filbert and Florian, or more closely examine the contents of their cart, but the moment he confiscated the mead, he became eager to get rid of them. As Alexander passed over the threshold of his homeland and proceeded forward along the road, his heart quickened. He couldn't be sure if it was dread or excitement that brought about the feeling. In reality, it was a peculiar combination of the two. End of chapter 21. All right, next time we'll jump into chapter 22, in which the twins only kill 2 people. See you later.